The sun hung low and merciless over Harrow Plantation that August morning, turning the cotton fields into a white sea that shimmered with heat. Samuel Harrow stood on his veranda, a glass of bourbon sweating in his palm, watching the overseer Marcus Dalton assemble his hunting party near the stables. 12 men, all armed, all eager. 3 slaves had vanished 2 nights prior. Abraham, a field hand with scars like rope burns around his wrists. Esther, a young woman who'd worked in the kitchen and hummed spirituals that made the white folks uneasy. And a boy named Thomas, barely 16, who'd watched his mother sold south the previous spring. They'd slipped away during a thunderstorm, and by the time the dogs caught their scent at dawn, the trail led deep into the pine forests along the Tombigbee River, Harrow country. But not really, not anymore. Marcus Dalton was a thick-necked man, with hands like iron and a reputation for bringing back runaways in pieces if necessary. He sat astride his chestnut mare, checking the load in his rifle, while the other overseers mounted up around him. There was Bill Henderson, who kept a collection of finger bones from slaves he'd killed. There was Dutch Carver, who'd been fired from 3 plantations for excessive brutality. There was young Tommy Pratt, barely 20, trying to prove himself among men who measured worth in cruelty. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. We'll have them back by nightfall, Marcus announced, his voice carrying across the yard where dozens of slaves pretended not to listen while they worked. Dead or alive, Mr. Harrow, your property will be accounted for. Samuel Harrow nodded, took a long drink, and said nothing. He'd inherited this land from his father, who'd bought it cheap after the Treaty of Cusseta drove the Creek Nation west. The old-timers still whispered that the soil here was cursed, that the Creek had burned their own villages rather than abandon them, that the smoke from those fires had poisoned the ground. But cotton grew well enough, and that was all that mattered to men like Samuel Harrow. The hunting party rode out at 8 in the morning, their horses kicking up red dust that hung in the air like a warning. They followed the river road north, past the ruined trading post where Creek families used to gather, past the unmarked graves that dotted the roadside like forgotten prayers. The forest grew denser as they rode, the pine trees pressing close, their needles thick enough to dim the sunlight to a murky green. Marcus Dalton led them single file along a narrow trail, following the dogs who strained at their leashes, baying with excitement. The scent was strong here, sweat and fear and the particular smell of slaves who'd been running hard. The men laughed and joked, passing a flask of whiskey, confident in their numbers and their weapons. They didn't notice when the birds stopped singing. They didn't notice when the dogs suddenly went quiet, ears flat, tails tucked. They didn't notice the symbols carved into the trees, old creek markings that meant sacred ground, and turn back and the dead watch here. By noon, they were deep in territory that hadn't seen white men in years. The Tombigbee River ran dark and fast to their left, its waters the color of old blood. The forest floor was soft, with decades of fallen needles muffling their horses' hooves. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out 3 times and went silent. Bill Henderson reined in his horse, frowning. "Dogs lost the scent," he muttered, watching the hounds circle aimlessly, whining. Marcus cursed and dismounted, examining the ground. The tracks were clear enough, 3 sets of bare feet, running north. But the dogs wouldn't follow. They kept looking back the way they'd come, trembling. "They're close," Dutch Carver said, scanning the tree line. "Can feel it. Probably watching us right now, scared witless." Young Tommy Pratt laughed nervously. 3 slaves against 12 of us. They'd have to be fools to try anything. That's when the first arrow hit. It came from nowhere and everywhere, a whisper of feathers and wood that punched through Tommy Pratt's throat and dropped him from his saddle before he could scream. He hit the ground convulsing, blood fountaining from the wound, his eyes wide with shock. For a frozen moment, nobody moved. They stared at Tommy choking on his own blood, at the arrow with its distinctive creak fletching, at the forest that had suddenly become very, very quiet. Then the forest exploded with violence. Arrows flew from the shadows, precise and deadly. Bill Henderson took one through the eye and toppled backward. Two more overseers fell in quick succession, one clutching at the shaft protruding from his chest, the other silent and still before he hit the ground. The horses screamed and reared, throwing their riders, bolting in panic back down the trail. Marcus Dalton managed to raise his rifle and fire blindly into the trees. The shot echoed like thunder, but there was no cry of pain, no sign he'd hit anything. He fumbled to reload, his hands shaking, when a figure emerged from behind a massive oak. It was a Creek warrior, his face painted with red and black ochre, his chest bare despite the heat, his eyes cold as winter stone. He held a rifle, an expensive one, probably taken from a trader or soldier. He wasn't alone. More warriors materialized from the forest, moving with the silence of men who'd grown up in these woods, who knew every root and shadow. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. Marcus tried to run. He made it 3 steps before a tomahawk caught him between the shoulder blades, driving him face first into the pine needles. He tried to crawl, gasping, blood pooling beneath him. A warrior knelt beside him, grabbed a fistful of his hair, and Marcus Dalton's last thought was how strange it was that the knife felt cold despite the heat. The massacre lasted less than 10 minutes. The overseers had rifles and experience and the confidence of men who'd terrorized the helpless for years. But this forest belonged to the Creek, and these warriors had been preparing for this moment since the day their people were driven west, since the day they'd buried their dead in secret and sworn oaths the white men would never understand. Some of the overseers tried to fight. Some tried to flee. It didn't matter. The Creek moved like water through the trees, their attacks coordinated and merciless. They didn't waste ammunition. They used blades and clubs and bare hands when necessary. They stripped the bodies of weapons and boots, then scalped each man with practiced efficiency, hanging the scalps from their belts like trophies. When it was done, the forest returned to silence. The Creek warriors gathered the rifles, powder, and shot. They rounded up the horses that hadn't bolted. And then they turned to face the 3 figures who'd been hiding in the hollow of a massive fallen cypress: Abraham, Esther, and young Thomas, the escaped slaves who'd led the hunting party straight into an ambush. The lead warrior approached Abraham, studied him for a long moment, then spoke in English thick with Creek accent. "You did well. They followed like dogs." Abraham nodded slowly, his eyes on the carnage around them. "They always do. Think we're helpless. Think we're nothing." Not nothing," the warrior said. He handed Abraham one of the rifles. "Free now, Creekland. No chains here." Esther stepped forward, trembling but determined. "The others at the plantation, hundreds still in bondage." The warrior's expression didn't change. "Tell them, when white men come looking for these," he gestured at the bodies, "tell them the forest remembers. Tell them the Creek don't forgive. Tell them some hunts don't end the way hunters expect." Young Thomas spoke up, his voice cracking. "They'll send soldiers. They'll burn the forest. Let them try." The warrior smiled without warmth. "This land drank Creek blood for generations. Now it drinks theirs. Balance." They spent the next hour erasing their tracks, dragging the bodies to the riverbank, where they arranged them in a deliberate display. They broke the rifles they didn't take, scattered the ammunition, carved messages into the trees in Creek and English, and on a fallen oak near the water's edge, using charcoal and blood, they wrote 3 words that would echo through Alabama history: "No chains here." As the sun began to set, painting the river gold and crimson, the Creek warriors melted back into the forest with Abraham, Esther, and Thomas. They moved north toward the deeper woods, where Creek families still lived in secret, maintaining the old ways, refusing to march west, surviving in the shadows of a land that had been theirs for centuries. Behind them, the bodies lay in the failing light. A message written in flesh and blood that some boundaries were older than law, some debts demanded payment in kind, and some forests kept secrets that white men would never uncover. The horses that had bolted found their way back to Harrow Plantation near midnight, wild-eyed and lathered with sweat, their saddles empty. Samuel Harrow stood in his yard, watching them arrive one by one, and felt ice settle in his stomach. He'd sent 12 men into those woods. Not one had returned on their own feet. The morning after the horses returned, Samuel Harrow assembled every available man on the plantation, field supervisors, house staff, even the blacksmith and carpenter. 37 men in total, armed with whatever weapons they could find. They rode out at dawn, following the same trail Marcus Dalton had taken, the air thick with humidity and dread. The slaves watched them go in silence. In the quarters, old Mercy, a woman who'd been born in Africa and remembered freedom, hummed a song that sounded like mourning and celebration wrapped together. The younger ones looked at her with questions in their eyes, but she just smiled and kept humming. By noon, the search party reached the bend in the Tombigbee where the massacre had occurred. What they found made several men vomit into the bushes. Others turned away, crossing themselves, muttering prayers to a god who seemed very far from this place. The bodies were arranged in a circle near the riverbank, all 12 overseers stripped naked, scalped, their weapons destroyed and scattered around them like broken promises. Someone had painted Creek symbols on the trees, in what looked like blood, spirals and arrows and animal figures that predated Christianity by 1,000 years. The message carved into the oak was clear enough even for men who couldn't read. No chains here. Samuel Harrow stood in the center of the carnage, his face grey as ash. He'd fought in the Creek War back in '36, had seen battlefields and massacres. But this felt different. This felt personal. This felt like judgment. "Sir," one of his men said quietly, pointing toward the forest. "Tracks lead north. Multiple riders. They took the horses." "How many?" Harrow's voice sounded hollow. "Hard to say. At least a dozen warriors, maybe more, moving fast and covering their trail good. And sir," the man hesitated, "there's other tracks too. Bare feet. 3 sets. The runaways went with them." Of course they did. Abraham, Esther and Thomas had led the overseers into a trap, had collaborated with Creek warriors to murder white men. The implications were staggering. If word spread through the slave quarters, if other plantation slaves started getting ideas, if the Creek decided to make this a regular occurrence, Harrow forced himself to think clearly. "Get the bodies loaded. We ride back now. Say nothing to the slaves, nothing. This information doesn't leave our group until I decide how to handle it." But information like that couldn't be contained. By the time they returned to the plantation that evening, the slaves already knew. They'd seen it in the white men's faces, in the way they rode, slumped in their saddles, in the wagons covered with canvas hiding what was underneath. They'd heard it in the silence that settled over the yard like fog. That night, in the quarters, the whispers began. Abraham had done it. Abraham, Esther, and Thomas had walked into those woods and come out free. The Creek had protected them. The Creek had killed white men, not soldiers or traders, but the overseers themselves, the men who wielded the whip and the chain. "I heard they're living among the Creek now," a young woman named Ruth whispered to the others gathered in her cabin. "Free, armed, never coming back to bondage." Old Mercy rocked in her chair, her milky eyes distant. "The land remembers," she said. "My grandmother told me. Before the white men came, the Creek and my people traded, lived in peace sometimes. The land remembers the old agreements, the old debts." "You saying the forest is on our side?" someone asked. Mercy smiled. "I'm saying the forest was here first. The Creek were here first. We were brought here in chains. But the land knows slavery is wrong, knows it poisons the soil. Sometimes the land fights back." The next morning, Samuel Harrow rode to Demopolis, the county seat, to report the massacre. The sheriff was a lean man named Coulter who'd made his fortune hunting runaway slaves and didn't appreciate hearing about dead overseers. 12 men, Coulter repeated, his face reddening. 12 white men killed by Creek savages and runaway niggers, and you waited a whole day to tell me. I wanted to assess the situation first, Harrow said stiffly. Understand what we're dealing with. What we're dealing with is an insurrection. Coulter stood, pacing behind his desk. If this gets out, if other slaves hear about it, we'll have uprisings across 3 counties. We need to act fast and hard. Make an example. An example of who? The warriors are long gone. Could be anywhere in 50 miles of forest. Coulter's eyes narrowed. Then we make an example of your slaves, the ones who might get ideas. We show them what happens when they so much as think about collaborating with Creek or running away. Harrow's jaw tightened. They're my property. I won't have them damaged without cause. Your property just helped murder 12 white men. I'd say that's cause enough. The argument continued for an hour, but eventually Coulter prevailed. He would assemble a militia both to hunt the Creek warriors and to restore order on Harrow Plantation. The governor would be informed. Rewards would be posted for Abraham, Esther, and Thomas, dead or alive, though preferably alive, so they could be made examples of publicly. When Harrow returned home that evening, he found his slaves working the fields with unusual intensity, not meeting anyone's eyes, their faces carefully blank. They knew something was coming. They could feel the storm gathering. That night, 3 more slaves disappeared from neighboring plantations, then 5 more the night after that. Each time, the trail led north into the pine forests along the Tombigbee, and each time, the tracking parties came back empty-handed, spooked by symbols carved in trees and the feeling of being watched by eyes they couldn't see. The slave quarters buzzed with barely suppressed excitement. The impossible had become possible. There was a place, somewhere in those forests, where Creek warriors protected runaways, where chains meant nothing, where white men's authority ended at the tree line. Harrow knew he was losing control. He could see it in the way his slaves looked toward the forest, in the way they hummed those old spirituals that now sounded like coded messages, in the way they smiled when they thought no one was watching. On the 5th night after the massacre, Harrow stood on his veranda with a bottle of bourbon, staring at the dark line of trees in the distance. Somewhere out there, Abraham was free, Esther was free, Thomas was free, and 12 men who'd thought themselves invincible were feeding the roots of trees that had witnessed their ancestors' crimes. Movement caught his eye. A figure stood at the edge of the cotton fields, just visible in the moonlight. For a moment, Harrow thought it was one of his slaves. Then he saw the rifle slung across the figure's back, the distinctive silhouette of Creek dress, the way the person stood with absolute confidence in hostile territory. It was Abraham. Just standing there, watching the plantation house, visible enough to be recognized but too far for a shot in the darkness. Making a point, sending a message. We're still here, we're still free, and we're not afraid of you anymore. Harrow reached for his rifle, but by the time he brought it to his shoulder, Abraham had vanished into the darkness as silently as he'd appeared. Harrow stood there for a long time, the rifle heavy in his hands, wondering how many others were out there watching, how many slaves in his quarters were dreaming of following Abraham's path, how many nights he had left before the forest claimed something more than 12 overseers. In the quarters, Ruth whispered to the others what she'd seen from her cabin window. Abraham, standing bold as brass at the field's edge, wearing Creek clothes and carrying a rifle. The whispers spread like wildfire. He'd come back, not to surrender, but to show them it was possible. Old Mercy rocked in her chair, humming that ancient song, and whispered to no one in particular, "The forest is calling, the Creek are calling, freedom is calling. Who will answer?" By morning, 2 more slaves from Harrow Plantation were gone, their absence discovered when the work bell rang at dawn. Their tracks led north toward the river, toward the pines, toward the place where 12 overseers had learned that some hunts ended differently than expected. Samuel Harrow stood in his yard, watching the sun rise over his fields, and knew with cold certainty that something had broken in the natural order of his world. The massacre hadn't ended with those 12 deaths. It had only begun. Sheriff Coulter arrived at Harrow Plantation 3 days later with 40 men, militia volunteers, professional slave catchers, and a handful of creek trackers who'd agreed to hunt their own people for silver. They made camp in the yard, their fires burning late into the night, their voices loud with bravado and whiskey. The slaves watched from the quarters, their faces carefully neutral, but their eyes tracked every movement, catalogued every weapon, noted every weakness. They'd learned generations ago how to observe without being seen, how to listen without appearing to hear, how to survive by becoming invisible. Coulter called a meeting in Harrow's parlor that evening, spreading maps across the mahogany table that had been built by slaves, whose names no one remembered. Present were Harrow, his remaining overseers, the militia captain, a scarred veteran named Pike, and 2 of the creek trackers, brothers named David and John, who wore white men's clothes and spoke English with careful precision. "We'll divide into 3 groups," Coulter explained, marking the maps with a pencil. "Group 1 sweeps north along the river. Group 2 moves east through the pine barrens. Group 3 circles west toward the old creek settlements. We trap them in a triangle, force them toward the open ground where we have the advantage." David, the older creek tracker, studied the map with an expression Harrow couldn't read. "The warriors won't be in the open ground. They'll stay in the deep forest where the old sacred sites are, where white men fear to go." "Then that's where we go," Pike said flatly. "No sacred ground is going to stop us from bringing back those killers." John glanced at his brother, something passing between them silently. "The forest is dangerous this time of year. The river runs high, easy to get turned around, lost. Men have vanished out there." "That's what we're paying you to prevent," Coulter snapped. "You know these woods, you know creek tactics. You keep us on track and alive, we pay you well. Simple as that." The brothers said nothing more, but Harrow noticed David's hand move to touch something hidden beneath his shirt. A medicine bag, probably, or some creek talisman. The gesture made Harrow uneasy. These men were helping hunt their own people. But where did their real loyalty lie? They set out at dawn the next morning, 40 armed men moving in 3 columns through terrain that grew more hostile with every mile. The pine forests thickened. The air became heavy with moisture from the river, and the heat pressed down like a physical weight. Within hours, several men were suffering from exhaustion, their fancy rifles feeling heavier with each step. Pike's group, which included Harrow and the 2 creek trackers, pushed north along the Tombigbee. They found signs of recent passage, trampled undergrowth, cold fire pits, a creek medicine symbol carved into a cypress tree. But the trail seemed to deliberately lead them in circles, looping back on itself, splitting and merging, until even David admitted he couldn't tell how many people they were tracking. "It's a game," David said quietly, kneeling beside a set of tracks that appeared and disappeared inexplicably. "They're playing with us, leading us deeper." "Then we're getting close," Pike said with satisfaction. "They wouldn't bother if we weren't making them nervous." David looked at his brother John, and again that silent communication passed between them. "Or they're leading us exactly where they want us." They pressed on. By afternoon, they'd reached a section of forest that felt different, older, quieter, heavy with a presence Harrow couldn't name. The trees here were massive, their trunks wide enough to hide behind, their branches forming a canopy so thick that sunlight barely penetrated. Spanish moss hung like grey beards from every branch, swaying in a wind that didn't reach the forest floor. "This is sacred ground," David said, stopping abruptly. "We shouldn't be here." Pike laughed harshly. "Your people lost the right to sacred ground when they lost the war. Keep moving." "You don't understand," John started to say, but Pike cut him off with a gesture. "I understand that 12 white men are dead, and we're being paid to fix that. Now move, or I'll assume you're with them and act accordingly. The brothers exchanged one more look, then David nodded slowly and continued forward. But Harrow noticed both men had shifted their rifles to an easier carry, their fingers closer to the triggers. They were expecting trouble. It came an hour later, when the sun was beginning to slant toward evening. The first arrow took Pike's second-in-command through the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the forest floor. The second hit another militiaman in the thigh. Then the forest erupted with the same deadly efficiency that had killed the overseers. Arrows from hidden positions appearing from angles that seemed impossible, finding gaps in cover with supernatural accuracy. "Return fire!" Pike roared, but the men were firing blindly, wasting ammunition on shadows and echo. The Creek warriors were invisible, their movements impossibly silent. Their attacks coordinated with the precision of people who'd lived and trained in these woods their entire lives. Harrow dropped behind a fallen log, his heart hammering. He'd seen combat during the Creek War, but this was different. Then they'd fought set battles, armies clashing in open fields. This was assassination, ambush, warfare that followed no rules white men understood. Through gaps in the moss and undergrowth, he caught glimpses of movement. Creek warriors painted for war, moving like water through the trees, some armed with rifles, others with bows and tomahawks. And among them he saw African faces, escaped slaves fighting alongside the creek, their expressions fierce with the kind of rage that came from years of chains and whips. "Fall back!" Pike was shouting. "Regroup at the river!" But falling back proved nearly impossible. The warriors herded them like animals, cutting off paths, forcing them deeper into territory that grew stranger and more hostile. Harrow stumbled over something and looked down to see a human skull, weathered and ancient, placed deliberately on a stone. Around them, more skulls emerged from the moss and roots, dozens, maybe hundreds, marking a burial ground that predated American settlement by centuries. This was a Creek graveyard. They'd been led straight into the resting place of ancestors. David and John had stopped retreating. They stood back to back, near an ancient oak, their rifles pointed at the militia, not the forest. "We told you," David said, his voice carrying. "We told you not to come here." "Traitors!" Pike spat, raising his rifle toward them. The brothers fired first, both shots perfectly placed. Pike went down, and the man next to him dropped a second later. The remaining militiamen stared in shock, trying to process that their Creek guides had turned on them. That's when the warriors emerged fully from the trees. 15, 20, maybe more. It was hard to count with the shadows and movement. They formed a loose circle around the remaining white men, their weapons ready but not raised, their faces painted with red and black ochre that made them look like spirits of vengeance, risen from the very graves the white men had desecrated. A warrior stepped forward, older than the others, his chest scarred with the marks of a chief or war leader. He spoke in Creek, his voice resonant and angry, and David translated quietly. He says you've violated sacred ground, says white men break every treaty, ignore every boundary, respect nothing. He says 12 overseers died for hunting human beings like animals. He asks how many more must die before white men understand that some lands, some people, are not theirs to own. Harrow found his voice. "We didn't come here for war. We came for justice." David translated, and the chief laughed bitterly. When he spoke again, David's translation was heavy with emotion. He says white man's justice is a whip and a chain, says Creek justice is older and truer, says the land itself has judged you and found you guilty. "We're not all slave owners," one of the militiamen said desperately. "Some of us are just poor farmers trying to survive." The chief responded, and this time it was John who translated. He says, "Poor white man or rich white man, you all benefit from slavery. You all stand on land stolen from Creek. You all think your skin makes you better than everyone else. He says the land is tired of your blood, but it will drink more if it must." For a long moment nobody moved. 20 Creek warriors and escaped slaves surrounded 8 remaining white men in a graveyard so old that the trees growing through it had been saplings when Columbus landed. The air smelled like earth and decay and something else, something that might have been the gathered rage of centuries. Then Abraham stepped forward from among the warriors. He'd been there the whole time, Harrow realized, fighting against the men who'd kept him in bondage. He looked different now, taller somehow, his posture no longer bowed by servitude, his eyes meeting Harrow's directly without the careful blankness slaves had to maintain to survive. "Mr. Harrow," Abraham said, and his voice carried an authority Harrow had never heard from a slave. "You want to know where we are? We're here. We're free. We live among people who don't measure human worth by skin color. We fight alongside people who remember what it means to resist tyranny instead of accepting it." "You're a slave," Harrow said, but even to his own ears it sounded hollow. The law is a chain," Abraham interrupted, "and chains can be broken. You came here hunting us, thinking you could drag us back, but we're not running anymore. None of us are. The Creek have given us something you can never understand. They've given us our humanity back." The chief spoke again, and David translated one final time. He says, "Go back. Tell the other plantation owners. Tell them the forest protects its own. Tell them every slave who reaches these woods will find sanctuary. Tell them every overseer who enters hunting human beings will face the same fate as the first 12. Tell them the Creek remember every broken treaty, every stolen land, every murdered child, and the debt is coming due." Then, impossibly, the warriors parted, creating a path back toward the river. The chief gestured toward it, an offer, or perhaps a command. "Leave now, while you still can." Harrow and the surviving militiamen didn't need to be told twice. They stumbled through the ancient graveyard, past the watchful eyes of warriors and freed slaves, their weapons feeling heavy and useless. Behind them, they heard singing, a Creek chant that blended with African spirituals, creating something new and defiant and utterly terrifying to men who'd built their fortunes on the assumption that some people were property. They reached the river as darkness fell, splashing through the shallow water, desperate to put distance between themselves and that sacred grove. When Harrow finally looked back, he saw figures silhouetted against the dying light. Abraham, Esther, Thomas, and others he didn't recognize, standing alongside Creek warriors as equals, as partners, as something the South had never imagined possible. Free. News of the second failed expedition spread through Alabama like fever. Sheriff Coulter had sent 40 men into the pine forests. 14 came back, including Samuel Harrow, their faces haunted and their stories fragmentary. Pike was dead. The Creek trackers had turned on them. The sacred graveyard had been full of warriors and armed slaves who'd somehow achieved what seemed impossible, a functioning alliance between Creek and African peoples united by a common enemy. The governor in Montgomery received Harrow's report with a grim expression. This wasn't just about runaway slaves anymore. This was about maintaining order, about preventing other slaves from believing freedom was possible, about ensuring that the very foundation of Southern prosperity, human bondage, didn't collapse because some Creek warriors and rebellious slaves had created a sanctuary in the woods. "We need federal troops," the governor told his advisors. "Militia won't cut it. These aren't just Creek or just runaways. They're organized, they're armed, and they're making fools of us." But federal troops meant explaining to Washington that Alabama couldn't control its own slave population. It meant admitting that Native Americans, who were supposed to have been removed, were still living on their ancestral lands, defending them successfully. It meant exposing weakness at a time when Northern abolitionists were already using every Southern misstep as ammunition in their propaganda war. The governor temporized, equivocated, sent strongly worded letters. Meanwhile, more slaves disappeared, 2 from Harrow Plantation, 5 from neighboring estates. a dozen from plantations further east. Not all made it to the forest sanctuary. Some were caught, whipped until they couldn't walk, sold south as examples. But enough succeeded that the impossible became tangible, the dream became achievable. In slave quarters across western Alabama, people whispered Abraham's name like a prayer. Old Mercy on Harrow Plantation held secret gatherings in her cabin after dark, teaching the younger generation about the old ways, the African traditions that had survived Middle Passage and slavery, the Creek customs she'd learned from traders and refugees. She spoke of unity between peoples who'd both been dispossessed, of ancient alliances that predated white men's arrival. The land remembers, she told them, as she'd told her own children and grandchildren. The spirits of those who died here, Creek and African both, they want justice. The forest is their sanctuary. When you run to them. They'll protect you, but you must earn it. You must prove you're willing to fight for your freedom, not just accept it as a gift. Samuel Harrow knew about these gatherings, but couldn't stop them without admitting he'd lost control. Instead, he increased patrols, limited movement between plantations, tried to isolate his slaves from news of the outside world. It was like trying to hold water in his hands. The stories seeped through anyway, mutating and growing with each retelling, until Abraham became almost mythical, a figure who'd walked out of bondage and into legend. 3 weeks after the second expedition, Harrow received a visitor. The man who rode up to his plantation was Creek, but dressed like a white man. Fine clothes, polished boots, a watch chain across his vest. He introduced himself as William Weatherford, a Creek chief who'd fought in the Creek War and eventually made peace, who now lived on a small farm and served as an intermediary between his people and white authorities. "Mr. Harrow," Weatherford said, accepting a glass of bourbon on the veranda. "I've come to discuss a delicate matter." "If you're here to defend those murderers," Harrow started, but Weatherford held up a hand. "I'm here to prevent more deaths on both sides." He took a sip, his expression carefully neutral. "There's a group in the deep forest, yes. Creek warriors who refuse to go west, who've lived hidden for years, surviving on what the land provides. They've been joined by escaped slaves. Together, they've created something unexpected. A criminal enterprise built on murder and theft," Harrow said flatly. "A community built on survival and mutual aid," Weatherford corrected gently. "From their perspective, they're defending themselves against aggressors. The overseers came hunting human beings. The militia came to destroy their sanctuary. Each time, they defended their territory." "It's not their territory. This is United States land, governed by United States law." Weatherford smiled sadly. "Is it? The treaties that gave this land to the United States were signed under duress, broken repeatedly, and obtained through fraud. The Creek who remain here consider those treaties invalid. They believe they're fighting a defensive war against an occupying force. And the slaves, what's their excuse for murder? They have no excuse because they recognize no crime." Weatherford set down his glass. "Mr. Harrow, I'm not here to debate the morality of slavery or the legality of treaties. I'm here because more expeditions will fail, more men will die, and eventually this situation will spiral into open warfare that benefits no one. There's another way, which is, let them go. Officially, you can claim the slaves died in the forest, killed by Creek savages. Unofficially, you cease all attempts to penetrate their territory. In exchange, they stop actively raiding plantations, stop encouraging more escapes, maintain their sanctuary for those who reach it, but don't send emissaries to recruit." Harrow stared at him. "You want me to just accept that I've lost property worth thousands of dollars? Accept that murderers go unpunished? Accept that there's a place in Alabama where white authority doesn't reach? I want you to accept reality." Weatherford's voice hardened slightly. "You've already lost those slaves. The 12 overseers are dead. Pike and 6 militiamen are dead. You can lose more men, more money, more face, or you can make peace with the situation and move on. Those are your actual choices. The other plantation owners will never agree. Then they'll keep losing slaves and burying overseers. Weatherford stood, preparing to leave. I've delivered my message. What you do with it is your decision. But understand this. The warriors in that forest have been fighting for survival since before you were born. They know every tree, every trail, every hiding place. The slaves who've joined them have nothing to lose and everything to gain. You cannot win this fight with force. You can only make it more expensive than you're willing to bear. After Weatherford left, Harrow sat on his veranda long into the evening, wrestling with impossible choices. Everything Weatherford said was probably true. But admitting defeat meant acknowledging that slavery itself wasn't the unshakable foundation he'd always believed it to be. It meant accepting that human beings would fight and die for freedom, would risk everything to escape bondage, would create alternative societies if given the slightest opportunity. That night, Harrow dreamed of the forest. In his dream, the trees were full of eyes, Creek warriors and African slaves watching him, judging him, waiting. He walked through the pine needles and Spanish moss, searching for something he couldn't name, until he reached the ancient graveyard where Pike had died. There, sitting on a fallen log, was Abraham. "You came hunting me," Abraham said in the dream, "but I was never yours to hunt." Harrow tried to speak, to assert his ownership, his authority, his right, but no words came. In the dream logic that revealed truth, he understood that he'd never really owned Abraham at all. You couldn't own a human soul any more than you could own the wind or the river. "The forest remembers," Abraham said, echoing Old Mercy's words. "And soon the whole South will remember too. You can't chain the wind, you can't whip the river, and you can't keep people in bondage forever when they've seen freedom is possible." Harrow woke in darkness, his sheets soaked with sweat. Outside he heard singing from the slave quarters, one of those spirituals that now sounded like coded rebellion. He recognized Old Mercy's voice leading the others, teaching them words that sounded like praise, but carried meanings white ears couldn't decipher. "Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water, the river." The Tombigbee, the path to freedom that ran through Creek territory where white authority couldn't reach. The song wasn't about baptism at all. It was a map, instructions, a promise that the water would wash away the scent for the dogs, that the river led to sanctuary. Harrow lay in his bed, listening to his slaves sing about escape, and knew he'd already lost. The question wasn't whether more would run. They would. The question was whether he'd waste more lives trying to stop them, or whether he'd accept Weatherford's offer and adapt to a new reality where the boundary of his authority ended at the forest's edge. In the quarters, Old Mercy finished the spiritual and began another one, her voice carrying across the cotton fields to the dark line of trees in the distance. And in that forest, in the sanctuary built by Creek warriors and freed slaves, Abraham heard the song floating through the pine needles and smiled. The forest was calling, and more people were answering. Summer turned to autumn, and the boundary between the plantation world and the forest sanctuary became more defined, more acknowledged, more real. Samuel Harrow never officially accepted Weatherford's proposal, but his actions spoke louder than words. He stopped sending expeditions into the deep woods. He stopped replacing overseers who quit rather than risk becoming the next scalping victim. He looked the other way when slaves disappeared, recording them as dead from fever or accident, avoiding the financial loss of admitting they'd escaped. Other plantation owners weren't so practical. Clayton Morrison, who owned 3,000 acres east of Harrow's land, assembled a private army of 30 men and went hunting for his escaped property with the determination of someone who'd never personally faced Creek warriors in combat. His expedition lasted 4 days. 17 men returned. Morrison wasn't among them. The survivors told conflicting stories: ambushes, traps, warriors who appeared and disappeared like smoke, escaped slaves fighting with the fury of people who'd rather die than go back to chains. They spoke of a village deep in the forest where Creek and African lived together, where children of both peoples played in the same clearings, where the old ways and new circumstances merged into something unprecedented in Southern history. News of Morrison's death sent shockwaves through Alabama's planter class. If a man with Morrison's wealth and resources could be killed by Creek and slaves working together, what did that mean for the institution of slavery itself? How could they maintain the fiction that slaves were content, docile, childlike and helpless when evidence of armed rebellion flourished just beyond their property lines? The plantation owners called meetings. They petitioned the governor. They wrote angry letters to newspapers, but privately more and more followed Harrow's lead, accepting losses, avoiding the forest, pretending the sanctuary didn't exist while quietly adjusting to a new reality. In the sanctuary itself, a unique community was taking shape. Abraham had become one of its leaders, not because of any official title, but because people listened when he spoke. He'd grown into the name he'd always had: Abraham, patriarch, father of multitudes, leader of people seeking promised land. The community numbered perhaps 200 souls now: Creek families who'd hidden from removal, warriors who'd fought in the Creek War and refused to surrender, escaped slaves from a dozen plantations, their children born free in the forest. They lived in dispersed camps that could be moved quickly if threatened, coming together for councils, ceremonies, and defense. Esther, who'd escaped alongside Abraham, worked as a healer, learning Creek medicine from the elder women, combining it with African knowledge passed down through enslaved generations. She'd found something in the forest she'd never had on the plantation: purpose beyond mere survival, community beyond mere proximity, hope beyond mere endurance. Young Thomas, who'd been 16 when he escaped, was 19 now, and one of the finest scouts in the sanctuary. He could move through the forest as silently as any Creek warrior, could track or evade with equal skill, had learned to speak Creek well enough to understand the old stories, the sacred traditions, the spiritual understanding of land that his own enslaved upbringing had denied him. The sanctuary's council met monthly under an ancient oak that had witnessed centuries of Creek history. Abraham sat beside Creek war chiefs, medicine women, escaped slave elders, and younger leaders from both peoples. They made decisions together, resolved disputes, planned for the future. "More will come," Abraham told the council one cool October evening. "Every slave who escapes successfully means 5 more dreaming of freedom. We need to expand our territory, establish clearer boundaries, maybe negotiate formal agreements with whites who'll leave us alone in exchange for peace." A Creek war chief named Red Eagle shook his head. "Negotiation implies we acknowledge their authority. Our ancestors made that mistake with treaties. All broken. All lies. We survived by hiding, by refusing to engage with white law. Why change that now?" "Because we're not hiding anymore," Esther said quietly. "Because our village has children who need futures. Because killing overseers and militiamen is self-defense. But at some point, defense becomes offense, and offense brings armies." "Let them come," a young warrior named Running Fox said hotly. "We've beaten them every time." "We've beaten small expeditions," Thomas corrected. "Federal troops are different. Trained soldiers with artillery and supply lines. If they decide we're a real threat, they'll come with hundreds of men, maybe thousands. We can't win that fight, not directly." The debate continued for hours, voices rising and falling beneath the oak's branches. Some wanted to expand the sanctuary's influence, actively recruit more slaves, perhaps even attack plantations directly. Others advocated for isolation, maintaining what they'd built without provoking the kind of response that could destroy everything. Finally, an elderly Creek woman named Cornflower spoke. She was nearly 80, had witnessed the Creek War, had seen her entire village burned, had walked the Trail of Tears until she escaped and returned to Alabama. Her voice carried the weight of survived catastrophe. "Both paths are dangerous," she said. "Isolation means slow death as the white world closes in around us. Expansion means fast death as armies come to crush us. But there is a third path. We become invisible while being visible. We let whites believe we're a small group of holdouts, not worth the effort of destroying. We quietly help those who escape, but we don't recruit actively. We defend our territory, but we don't raid theirs. We survive in the spaces between their attention, like Creek have always survived." Abraham listened carefully. Cornflower's wisdom came from experience. White men couldn't imagine, and slaves rarely survived to accumulate. "You're saying we accept limits, stay small, stay hidden." "I'm saying we stay alive." Her milky eyes fixed on Abraham with unexpected intensity. "You young ones, you who've tasted freedom, you want to shout it from the mountains. I understand. But survival sometimes means whispering instead of shouting, means accepting partial victories instead of complete triumphs." The council voted. Cornflower's counsel prevailed barely. They would maintain the sanctuary, defend it absolutely, welcome those who reached it, but avoid provocations that would draw federal attention. It was pragmatic, unsatisfying, and probably the only reason the community would survive the coming decades. As autumn deepened, the sanctuary prepared for winter. Greek techniques for smoking meat and preserving vegetables merged with African knowledge of root crops and foraging. Children learned to read from a handful of books stolen or bought from traders, learned Creek and English, and fragments of African languages preserved through oral tradition. They grew up free, never knowing chains, their laughter echoing through woods where their parents had once lived in fear. On Harrow Plantation, old Mercy died peacefully in her sleep one November night. She was nearly 90. Had survived middle passage, slavery, and enough grief to drown a lesser soul. Her funeral drew slaves from neighboring plantations, all of whom sang spirituals that sounded like freedom songs, that carried meanings white overseers couldn't decipher even when they heard them clearly. Samuel Harrow attended the funeral, standing at a distance, watching his property mourn a woman who'd probably helped dozens escape to the forest sanctuary. He should have been angry, should have punished the obvious celebration hidden beneath the grief, but he just felt tired. The world was changing. The sanctuary existed whether he acknowledged it or not. Slaves knew freedom was possible, had seen it achieved, had concrete proof that bondage wasn't inevitable. The old certainties, white supremacy, absolute property rights, the natural order of racial hierarchy, were revealed as hollow constructions that required constant violence to maintain. After the funeral, a young slave named Isaiah approached Harrow hesitantly. He was 15, had been born on the plantation, was considered good property because he worked hard and caused no trouble. "Sir," Isaiah said, his eyes downcast in the manner slaves learned early, "Miss Mercy, before she passed, she gave me a message for you." Harrow felt a chill. "What message?" "She said to tell you that the land remembers everything, every drop of blood, every tear, every injustice. She said you can't own people any more than you can own the rain, and fighting what's natural just makes you tired. She said—" Isaiah hesitated, seemed to gather courage. "She said you should let go before you drown in what you're trying to hold." Harrow stared at the boy. "She said that?" "Yes, sir, she made me memorize it exactly. You can go." Isaiah left, and Harrow stood alone in the yard, Mercy's words echoing, "Let go before you drown." The metaphor was clear enough. Holding on to slavery, trying to maintain absolute control, fighting against the tide of history and humanity would ultimately destroy him. But letting go meant admitting everything he'd built was wrong, unjust, unsustainable. That night, Harrow did something he'd never done before. He walked to the slave quarters after dark, alone, unarmed. People watched him from doorways, silent and wary. He stopped at Mercy's cabin, where her grandchildren were sorting her few possessions. "I need to know," Harrow said quietly. "The ones who escaped. the ones who made it to the forest. Are they happy? Ruth, who'd whispered Abraham's name like a prayer, looked at him directly, a boldness that would have earned a whipping before Morrison's death. They're free, sir. You can't be happy if you're not free. You can have moments of joy, but not happiness. That requires owning yourself. And you? Harrow asked. You could run, many of you could. Why stay? Some of us have family we won't leave. Some are too old or sick for the journey. Some are waiting, planning, building courage. She smiled slightly. And some of us were helping others get ready, making sure when they run, they make it. Harrow should have been outraged by the admission, should have called overseers, demanded names, instituted punishments. Instead, he just nodded slowly and walked back to his house, understanding in his bones that the world Mercy had known, the world he'd inherited from his father, was ending. You could fight endings, but you couldn't stop them. The first snow fell in December, rare for Alabama, but heavy enough to dust the pine forests white. In the sanctuary, Creek and African people celebrated together, teaching their children how to read tracks in fresh snow, how to stay warm in winter, how to survive in a world that wanted them dead but couldn't quite reach them in their forest refuge. And somewhere in those woods, Abraham stood at the edge of a clearing, watching snowflakes fall through pine branches, listening to children laugh as they played, and thought about the 12 overseers who died hunting him. Their deaths had been necessary, defensive, just, but they'd also been the beginning of something larger, a crack in the institution of slavery, a proof that the impossible could become possible, that chains could indeed be broken if people were willing to risk everything. The forest remembered, and it was patient, and eventually, in ways Harrow and men like him couldn't yet imagine, the forest's memory would reshape the South itself. Winter passed, and spring came early in 1841. The sanctuary had survived its first full year, had grown from desperate refuge to functioning community, had proven that Creek and African peoples could not only coexist, but thrive together when united by common cause and mutual respect. 243 souls now called the forest home, warriors and healers, farmers and hunters, elders and children, all living in freedom that the surrounding plantation world insisted was impossible. Abraham had aged visibly in that year. Freedom suited him, but leadership carried weight. He was 32 now, scarred from field work and fighting, his hair touched with grey that hadn't been there when he'd fled Harrow Plantation. He stood taller than he had in bondage, carried himself with the confidence of a man who owned his own fate. But his eyes held the knowledge that everything they'd built was fragile, temporary, contingent on the forbearance of a world that didn't believe in their right to exist. The council met under the ancient oak on a warm April evening, discussing the future. Spring meant more escape attempts. Slaves could survive in the woods without winter gear, could follow the Tombigbee north when the river ran gentle and the forest provided food. Already 5 new arrivals had stumbled into the sanctuary that month, including a woman named Patience, who'd walked 60 miles with her infant daughter strapped to her back. "We need to establish outposts," Thomas argued. He was 20 now, one of the sanctuary's best scouts, fearless and sharp. "Places where runaways can rest, get directions, receive help. Right now, too many die in the forest before they reach us." Red Eagle frowned. "Outposts mean more exposure, more chance of discovery." "They're dying anyway," Esther countered. "We've found 3 bodies this spring alone. People who escaped but couldn't find us, who starved or were killed by animals or just got lost. If we had way stations with food caches and marked trails lead whites straight to us," an older Creek warrior interrupted. "Not if we mark them properly," Thomas said. "Creek symbols that whites can't read, African patterns that only slaves would recognize. We can hide directions in plain sight." The debate continued, but gradually consensus formed. They would establish 3 hidden outposts, staffed by volunteers, stocked with basic supplies. The risk was real. but so was the moral imperative to help those seeking freedom. Meanwhile, in the plantation world, pressure was building from different directions. Northern abolitionists had gotten wind of the Alabama sanctuary through freed slaves' testimony in the North. Newspapers in Boston and Philadelphia ran breathless stories about Creek and African peoples living together in freedom, defending their land from slave catchers, creating a functioning alternative to slavery. The stories were partially true, partially exaggerated, but all of them infuriated Southern planters who saw their entire social order threatened by the example. The governor received letters demanding action. Federal authorities made quiet inquiries about using army troops to destroy the sanctuary. But 1841 was an election year, and President William Henry Harrison had died in office after just a month, leaving John Tyler to navigate complex sectional tensions. The last thing Tyler wanted was federal troops attacking a mixed Creek African community that northern newspapers had romanticized as freedom fighters. So the situation remained in uneasy equilibrium. The sanctuary existed. Plantations lost slaves. White authorities grumbled and threatened, but took no definitive action. And slowly, inevitably, the impossible became normalized. Samuel Harrow sold his plantation that spring. He couldn't admit it was because he'd lost faith in slavery, couldn't acknowledge that Mercy's words had burrowed into his conscience like splinters. He told people he was retiring, moving to Mobile, investing in shipping rather than agriculture, but the truth was simpler. He couldn't watch his property run away anymore, couldn't pretend he owned people when they kept proving they owned themselves. The new owner was a hard man named Vickery, fresh from South Carolina, full of confidence that he could restore order. He instituted brutal punishments, increased patrols, brought in dogs trained to track runaways. For a few weeks, it seemed to work. No one escaped. The slaves kept their eyes downcast, their voices quiet. Then, on a moonless night in May, 23 slaves disappeared from Harrow Plantation. Now, Vickery Plantation. They'd been organized by Ruth, who'd spent years watching, planning, building networks. They moved as a group, protecting each other, following trails marked with Creek and African symbols, resting at the newly established outposts where Thomas and other scouts had cached supplies. Vickery went apoplectic. He assembled 50 men, hired professional slave catchers with the best dogs in Alabama, spent a fortune on the hunt. They tracked the group to the forest's edge. Then the dogs stopped, whining and refusing to enter terrain, marked with symbols the animals somehow understood meant danger. Vickery pushed forward anyway. His expedition lasted 2 days. They found one outpost, empty but clearly used. They found creek markings warning them to turn back. They found the remains of a campfire with footprints leading deeper into terrain that grew more hostile with every mile. On the second evening, arrows began falling from the trees. Vickery lost 4 men before he ordered retreat. They fled back to the plantation in disorder, the famous slave catchers admitting they'd never encountered anything like the organized resistance in those woods. All 23 escaped slaves reached the sanctuary. Ruth was among them. She stood in the main clearing, surrounded by free people, and wept with relief and joy, and the overwhelming sensation of finally being human in the fullest sense. Abraham welcomed her with a quiet dignity that spoke of shared experience. You led them all out safely. That took courage. I had a good example, Ruth replied, smiling through tears. You showed us it was possible. That summer, the sanctuary's population grew to 300. Children were born free, old people died free, young people grew up never knowing chains. Creek elders taught African youth about forest craft and spiritual traditions. African elders taught Creek children songs and stories that had survived Middle Passage. The communities merged slowly, respectfully, creating something genuinely new. Not everything was harmonious. There were disputes over resources, cultural misunderstandings, personality conflicts that exploded into arguments. But the council handled them, developing conflict resolution processes that drew on Creek and African traditions, creating governance that prioritized community needs over individual power. By autumn, plantation owners had mostly adapted to the new reality. Some, like Vickery, kept trying to reclaim escaped property and kept failing. Others quietly accepted losses, stopped pursuing runaways past the forest boundary, focused on preventing escapes rather than punishing them. The sanctuary became an open secret. Everyone knew it existed, but authorities tacitly agreed not to provoke confrontation that would require federal intervention. The turning point came in November. A slave from Georgia, a man named Frederick, escaped after killing his overseer in self-defense. He ran 500 miles through hostile territory, guided by the underground network of symbols and safe houses that had developed. When he finally stumbled into the sanctuary, he carried news that electrified the community. "There are sanctuaries like this," Frederick told the council, his voice rough with exhaustion and excitement. "In the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia, in the Okefenokee in Georgia, in the Everglades in Florida, escaped slaves living with Seminole, with Creek, with communities that remember how to resist. We're not alone. This is happening everywhere. The forest is deep enough. The will is strong enough." Nay, the council absorbed this information in silence. They'd thought themselves isolated, unique, precarious. But if what Frederick said was true, they were part of something larger. A network of resistance that stretched across the South, creating spaces of freedom in the margins of the slave system. "We need to connect with them," Thomas said immediately. "Share information, coordinate escapes, build communication networks." Red Eagle looked troubled. "That increases risk. Every connection is a vulnerability. Every connection is also strength," Abraham countered. "They'll come for us eventually, when the political situation changes. When that happens, we need allies." They debated long into the night. Finally, they agreed to send scouts to other sanctuaries, to establish communication, to begin building what would eventually become part of the Underground Railroad's southern network, less organized than the northern routes, more dependent on indigenous allies, but no less vital to those seeking freedom. Winter came again. The sanctuary prepared, now experienced in survival, confident in their methods. Abraham stood at the edge of the main clearing on the shortest day of the year, watching children play in light snow, listening to Creek and African languages blend into new dialects, observing the community that had grown from 3 desperate runaways into a viable alternative society. Esther joined him, her healer's bag over her shoulder. She'd just delivered a baby, a girl born to a Creek mother and African father, a child who would grow up free, who would never know chains, who would carry in her blood the union of peoples. "Do you think we'll survive?" Esther asked quietly. Abraham considered carefully. "Long enough to matter. Long enough for others to see it's possible. Whether this specific sanctuary lasts 10 years or 100, we've already proven the point. You can't own human beings. Not really. Not permanently. We'll always find ways to be free. They'll keep trying to destroy us, and we'll keep resisting." Abraham smiled slightly. "That's what humans do. We survive. We adapt. We find freedom even in impossible circumstances." The 12 overseers learned that lesson. Vickery learned it. Eventually the whole South will learn it. Miles away in what was now called Vickery Plantation, a young slave named Isaiah, the same boy who delivered Mercy's message to Harrow, stood at the edge of the cotton fields, looking toward the dark line of trees. He was 17 now, strong, smart, and increasingly unwilling to accept bondage as his fate. In his pocket, he carried a small piece of cloth with Creek symbols sewn into it. A gift from Ruth before she'd escaped, a map of sorts, instructions for finding the sanctuary. He'd been studying those symbols for months, memorizing them, waiting for the right moment. Spring would come again. The river would run gentle. The forest would welcome those brave enough to enter it. And Isaiah, like Abraham and Esther and Thomas and Ruth before him, would walk away from the plantation, away from chains, toward the trees that promised freedom to those willing to fight for it. The massacre of 1840 had been both ending and beginning. 12 overseers died, and their deaths opened a door. Not to chaos or race war or the nightmares plantation owners imagined, but to something simpler and more profound, the demonstration that human beings, regardless of origin or skin color, would fight for freedom, would unite against oppression, would create alternatives to slavery if given the slightest opportunity. The forest remembered, the creek remembered, the African peoples remembered. And slowly, inexorably, their memories would reshape the South itself, not through violent revolution but through persistent resistance, the steady drip of escapes, the accumulating weight of people choosing freedom over bondage, trees over chains, humanity over property. In the sanctuary, the fire burned bright against the winter darkness. People gathered around it, Creek and African, old and young, warriors and farmers, parents and children. They sang songs that blended traditions, told stories that honored both people's histories, made plans for a future their grandparents never could have imagined. And deep in the forest, where 12 overseers had died hunting human beings, the trees stood witness. The land remembered, and in its roots and soil and the wind through its branches, justice, slow, patient, inevitable, continued its work.